Welcome to our monthly web debate. Today we look at multilateral diplomacy in times of COVID-19. My name is Katharina Höhne. I'm a senior researcher with DiploFoundation, and I have the pleasure to moderate the debate. At Diplo, we organize monthly debates on key issues in diplomatic practice and theory. For the last 4 years, we do so in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. Since this year marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, we have chosen this as one of our focal points for this series. So today, we are talking about multilateral diplomacy in times of COVID-19. And to begin with, we seem to be faced by a paradox or a dichotomy. On the one hand, we have reports that countries divert shipments of masks and equipment. On the other hand, there are examples of enormous solidarity. And all of this comes before a background of vastly different capabilities of countries to deal with the crises. And while there's a general agreement that joint efforts are needed, lots of initiatives seem to be largely unilateral. At the same time, the work of the UN is clearly important. For example, for many around the world, the briefings of the World Health Organization provided crucial information on the emerging crises. 2 weeks ago, the UN Secretary General called for a global ceasefire in all corners of the world. And he launched a report titled Shared Responsibility, Global Solidarity, Responding to the Socioeconomic Impact of COVID-19. So to make it short, in this debate, we will look at 3 points: the role of multilateral diplomacy in the crises. Second, the specific role of the UN system and, of course, the WHO. And third, possible adaptations of the multilateral systems and the question of how it will emerge after the crises. To do this, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. So let me introduce them. We have Ambassador Umesh Bhatia, who is Singapore's permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva, and he is joining us from just outside Geneva. We have Fabrizio Hochschild, who is a special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the preparations for the commemoration of the United Nations 75th anniversary. And last but not least, we have Dr. Owain Williams, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Leeds, focusing on global health governance. And he's joining us from Australia at the moment. So with our speakers, we are kind of spanning the globe. Let me also remind you, our audience, that we're trying to make this debate as interactive as possible. So please post your comments and questions in the chat. We will try to collect as many as possible and relay them back to our speakers. And I will do that with the help of my colleagues, Natasha Perucica and Katarina Andjelkovic. And this way we will bring the questions back into the debate. But without further ado, let's start. And I would like to start with Ambassador Bhatia, because he's now the permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva, and he has served at Singapore's permanent mission in New York at the United Nations, also while Singapore was in the Security Council. So I'm really interested to kind of see what your general sense of the multilateral system in this crisis is. And more specifically, as I said, we've seen both examples of increasing nationalism and examples of international solidarity. So from your perspective, how is multilateral diplomacy coping?
Well, thank you very much, Katrina. I will dispense with the usual formalities and get straight into the meat of it. I've served in New York. I'm also Singapore's ambassador to the UN in Geneva as well as Vienna. So I have an opportunity to look at the way things are working across the various arenas of convening power called the UN. And it's clear, it's already a truism, I think, to say that the UN system and multilateralism is certainly facing its greatest challenge since its founding after the Second World War. And for a country like Singapore, for many small states, multilateralism is actually, I would say, a necessity. It's not an optional extra. So this is of deep concern to us. And clearly, we're being faced by a pandemic, something that requires a joined-up response. So I'm very, very glad you mentioned the Secretary General's call and for global responsibility and solidarity. Now, we're still in the throes of the crisis. So many people have made snap assessments. Some people have talked about, is this the end of multilateralism? And this confirms the rise of nationalism, populism. Is this the end of the liberal order? So some of these are no doubt perhaps premature, and some people talking about the last throes of various global orders, of political orders, and the rise of nationalism might be a little bit premature and exaggerated. But what is increasingly clear, and we can't deny, is that fundamentally we cannot return to the old way of doing things. We need to take what we have and go forward with it. And this is a test of whether multilateralism really works. This is a test of what's essential, of what we need to do to reform multilateralism, and what we need to do to reform the UN. Now, so far, when we talk about the UN system, and I've seen it, bits of it in Geneva, bits of it in Vienna, and from what's happening in New York, I think we have to say that there's not one UN, but a couple of UNs. There has not, to my mind, been a comprehensive, I would say, all of UN strategy at the global level that helps the member states to basically suppress the transition of this, suppress this virus, to have a whole of UN approach. That's clearly something that's required. There's a different sort of like pace of different parts of the UN system. Some have more visibility, some have reacted faster, some a little bit slower. So that whole of UN approach for me is really crucial, it's required. And there seems to be a bit of competition for resources and visibility. I think we need to coordinate this. The UN system needs to come together, member states need to come together. It's very, very crucial. And I'll end by saying, you know, we think it's very important that we have to send a signal of solidarity. And, you know, on 2nd of April, a few days ago, the UN General Assembly adopted its very first resolution on COVID-19 called the Global Solidarity to Fight COVID-19. And there was a core group of countries. Singapore was one of them, Switzerland, 6 countries, Singapore, Switzerland, Ghana, Indonesia, Liechtenstein, and Norway, decided to table this resolution. We got 188 co-sponsors, which is massive, and to express solidarity with all countries battling this crisis. And the idea was to reaffirm commitment to international cooperation, to multilateralism, and call really for intensified cooperation to combat this pandemic. So there are additional UNGA resolutions that are being discussed, but we think this is the way forward. And I think I'll leave it at that for my opening comments. Thank you very much, Karina.
Thank you. I actually want to ask a follow-up question there, because you mentioned solidarity and the importance of the multilateral system of the UN for small countries, for developing countries.
Yes.
Can you maybe expand a bit on this point about solidarity, also the resolution you just mentioned?
Right.
What perhaps is the expectation there?
Well, first and foremost, I would say the key issue is when we had, you know, I was in New York during 9/11, and I was part of a small team that drafted a resolution. I think it was Resolution 1367, which basically was the 1368 was the first response to the attacks of 9/11, and it came pretty fast. But with COVID-19, it took some time for everyone to come together, and there was some discussions in New York Security Council, but they didn't really sort of like cohere. So we decided there must be at the very least, a coming together of countries to say, look, let's have a global call for solidarity. We need to at least do that. We need to be on the same page. We established the same page. Now, in terms of where we go from here, there'll be many initiatives. There'll be a lot of proposals, but at least we're all going to say these are some basic rules of the road, some basic expectations all of us have. And if you look through the resolution, I think that'll be quite clear. Some of it is hortatory, sure. Some of it perhaps could have been further refined, but we needed to get something out quickly. That was very, very crucial.
Thank you. And I think this is a perfect jumping off point to turn to our next speaker, Under Secretary General Fabrizio Hochschild. As I mentioned in the beginning, he's the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the preparations for the commemoration of the United Nations 75th anniversary. So I think this is an ideal opportunity to kind of take us a bit deeper into the UN system. And I'd like to start by looking a bit more at this report of the Secretary General that was launched in March, as I said, shared responsibility, global solidarity. So with that in mind, what observations can you share with us at this point from the perspective of inside the UN system?
Thank you very much, and I'd like to congratulate our friends from the DiploFoundation, an institution we've long admired and cooperated with, for taking this useful initiative. I mean, all I can do is really underline the outstanding comments made by Ambassador Bhatia. The Secretary General's view is, first, this is not another financial crisis. This is not only a public health crisis. It is a massive public health crisis of the type we haven't seen before. And the very first priority has to be responding to that. But this is a crisis with much broader and larger dimensions. It's a public health crisis that is going to affect, is already affecting how societies work and relate to one another, and will have dramatic economic fallout, dramatic development fallout. And we have to look at this through the lens of solidarity. And that has been the banner, global solidarity, which has underlined all his messaging, all his efforts. I mean, we've been reminded in a very tragic way about the interconnectivity of our world, and how threats to some end up very quickly becoming threats to all, and can be only resolved to the extent we take a global perspective. So he has called for an approach that really puts the poorest and the most disadvantaged, who inevitably will feel the greatest weight of this crisis, both in terms of its effects on their health and in terms of effects on their jobs and their livelihoods, for an approach that focuses on them first, and where there's international solidarity between the more fortunate countries and the less fortunate countries. And the trouble is that inevitably, and to a large extent also understandably, the initial response will always be one of being a little bit inward looking and focusing directly on one's own needs. And while that is of course essential, so nobody's saying that shouldn't happen, and nobody's questioning that governments' first obligations are to their own citizens. The point is that if we want to adequately protect our own citizens in an era of globalization, in an era of global interconnectedness, we have to look to the welfare of everyone. And that's the same in this case. So he's put out he started a solidarity fund. He's put out a very, very concrete plan of action. He's talked to the G20, the G7, obviously the Security Council and the General Assembly about approaches that deal both with the health crisis, underlining the messages and the leadership of WHO, but also about dealing with the socio-economic and other aspects of the crisis. And one of his messages, solidarity, and the second message is we have to build back better. It's not a question of going back to the status quo ante. The status quo ante, in some sense, exacerbated the situation we're in today. If we're not dealing adequately with the virus, and we have rather fragmented, not joined up approaches, which will lead to loss of life, it was. And moving forward, we just have to do better. We have to do better for the next pandemic, and we have to do better for slow onset disasters that will be as or more devastating, like climate change. So those are the messages that the Secretary General is elaborating and promoting.
Thank you. I also would like to use this opportunity, since we have the honor of having you with us, to ask you to reflect on the preparations for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. I mentioned this in the very beginning, and I also mentioned that the series of web debates that we're running throughout the year is focusing on the UN system because of that anniversary. So in light of COVID-19, what are your reflections on these preparations that you are leading?
Well, you know, the the contemplation and the design of UN 75 happened before COVID-19, but I think its urgency and importance has only grown. The Secretary General's view was that at the 75th anniversary, and this was before COVID, there really wasn't too much to celebrate. The world was dealing poorly with climate change that was threatening the very sustainability of our planet, the very future of our kids and our grandkids. It was dealing poorly with growing inequalities and rising tensions. It was dealing poorly with the proliferation of prolonged conflict. It was not dealing adequately with migration and demographic changes. And we needed to take stock, and we needed to work out where we're heading and how we can do a course correction. And we needed to go back to the voices of we the peoples. And that was really how we set up UN 75, as a global listening exercise to hear what people thought about their hopes for this globe, where they thought we were heading, and how international cooperation, and the UN in particular, could improve its performance to better deliver on people's aspirations and better head off some of the global threats. And of course, that has grown more urgent. I mean, if we wanted a horribly tragic illustration of why the world is interdependent and why we need to work better together, well, COVID-19 provided that in a way that none of us anticipated, and that is really truly tragic. But there's still a big outstanding question. The big outstanding question is this: will this virus help us come to our senses? Will this enforced state of retreat and meditation make us wiser, make us realize that we all have global responsibilities? Every one of us on our planet have to think both of our own welfare, both of our own interests, both of the interests of our communities. But if we're to do justice to our own welfare and to those of our communities, we also have to think about the globe. We also have to think about next generations. Will we come to that realization? Or will this crisis lead us more divided, more fragmented, more distrustful, more isolationist, more inward looking, more short-term oriented than ever? And I think that's an open question. And if you read the headlines, you see trends in both directions. You see tremendous acts of international solidarity, Cuban doctors flying at great risk to their own lives to Italy to help out. I see incredible acts of solidarity between the simplest of people here in New York. But you also see a stepping up of ugly rhetoric and greater friction between states. So how do we ensure that we build back better, as the Secretary General has asked? How do we ensure that we come out of this wiser, with stronger, modernized, invigorated approaches to deal better with the next crisis, to head off the slow onset crisis? We need to bring in the voices of we the peoples, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. This cannot be left to political interests alone. This cannot be left to short-term thinking alone. We need to hear and bring those voices to global leaders everywhere, what people want for the future, how they see international solidarity and their priorities in that respect. So we're stepping up our efforts. Obviously, we've had to switch much more to digital. We'd anticipated a lot of in-person meetings. That's no longer possible. But we are working with a lot of big platforms to step up our efforts for digital dialogues and for digital responses to our survey. And that's working reasonably well, because this is the time that we really need to take stock of whether the direction we've been heading in is the right one, or whether it's not time to use this crisis to do better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think when we provide the summary for this debate, we should include a link of where people can actually find the resources to participate in this kind of debate and consultation. Speaking of bringing different voices in, I think it's high time that we kind of see what's been happening in the chat and what the key comments and questions so far have been. Right now with us live, we have almost 140 people. So this is a challenge, and this is a challenge I can't tackle on my own. That's why I have my colleague Natasha Perucica, who is going to attempt to summarize some of the key questions and comments that have been coming in so far. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Kat. The discussion in the chat has been very, very lively. We have received many comments. I will try to cover the ones that received the most attention, so to speak. Before we actually started the webinar, there was a comment from the High Commissioner who noted that the United Nations office in Geneva is looking at various platforms to conduct virtual meetings with interpretation, and that they are not quite there yet, but they are hoping to service an informal dialogue of the Human Rights Council with the High Commissioner this week with interpretation in English and in French. Discussions on the response of multilateralism and how it responds to crisis continued. There was Richard Hill who said that international organizations are behind the curve, and this is mostly because they lack insufficient funding. Jovan Kurbalia explained that this is also the reason why they are behind is also because of the lack of agility in their response. Denise Demicoli noted that multilateral dealings will not be the same again after this shift online, and that the United Nations needs to think of a new online way of multilateralism, primarily because at this moment states are concerned with their own needs. There were comments that multilateral diplomacy is also very important for small population and small states, given that they sustain a domestic value chain that depend on the global economy. There were other comments on the participation of least developed countries and small island developing states, from Carlos Garcia, who said that in the current times and taking into account the digital gap, how we can guarantee that these countries are able to participate in virtual meetings and to allow for a broad representation from the developing world. There was another comment by Flair, who noted that the developed countries are the most affected, and the least developed countries are least affected, but they have less to offer an effort by multilateralism. And there was also a question for Fabrizio, where basically Mark asked, does this crisis provide any hints on how we can come together without having a pandemic type event to make it happen? And the last comment by Yolanda Spice, who noted that this current crisis is making us all aware how important IT diplomacy is.
Thank you, Natasha. There's a lot to digest, but I would like to take the opportunity to give each of our speakers, although we haven't heard explicitly from Dr. Owen Williams yet, to give each of the speakers a chance to respond, maybe to pick a specific question or a specific comment that struck you in particular. And I know we had one direct question to Fabrizio, but just your initial short reactions or comments, and maybe we can go in the same order that we started. So Ambassador Batia, Fabrizio Hochschild, and then Owen Williams. Over to you for your responses and reflections.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Well, firstly, I want to say that before you can even talk about digital diplomacy or digital multilateralism, the actual multilateralism and diplomacy has to be there, and it has to be in good working order. And then we can talk about platforms and so on and so forth. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is a huge wake-up call for multilateralism. It's a huge wake-up call for the world. I echo many of the sentiments of Fabrizio. But I also want to say that we shouldn't be in a sort of doom and gloom mode. I think we should recognize that certain things have been done. I must commend the World Health Organization, here being in Geneva in the backyard of global health. They've used the convening power, Dr. Tedros, they've used the convening power to really rally member states to coordinate a global response to COVID-19. A lot of credit here to Dr. Tedros. States have come together, there have been regular briefings, answering questions. I attended some of the physical briefings before we went into this into telecommute mode, and people have come to support the WHO's Strategic Preparedness Response Plan. It's surpassed the WHO's initial target of 675 million. As Fabrizio said, I think this brings out the best of us, and like any crisis, it also brings out the worst in us. But let's focus on the best. Let's focus on the better angels for our nature. We've got the Solidarity trial to fast-track development of potential vaccines, efforts underway to coordinate the supply and demand for global essential supplies. And 2 more points. You know, I think it's very easy to just simply sort of slip back and focus on the negative, the nationalism, the populism, and all of that. But, you know, earlier this week, my president came together with several other heads of state, President of Germany, Ethiopia, Greece, as well as King Abdullah of Jordan. And they wrote to the Financial Times with a very clear message. And that message was, no time for geopolitical turf battles. And the most convincing way to address the global dimension of this crisis is through cooperation and solidarity. So that's very important. And the final point is, we even have, in a way, a positive initiative. The foreign ministers of Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Myanmar, Singapore, and New Zealand have agreed basically to remove any existing restrictive measures on essential goods. This was on 26 March. So there are positive moves being made, not just hortatory, which is important, not just global opinion being pulled together, but real a push to say, let's have these new norms, let's try and be positive, let's try and bring ourselves together and bring out the better angels for our nature through this crisis.
Thank you so much. And I think it was a very important comment, because we're all talking about digital tools and going online. And obviously Diplo is focusing a lot on these topics. But the question, as you mentioned, is also how is the multilateral system beyond that in good shape, and how can we improve it? With that point, over to Undersecretary General Hochschild, your reflections and comments on what we heard from our participants so far. Sorry to interrupt, but you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you, sorry.
Right. No, I think the comments are very insightful. Just on the point, to start with the point on digital, this crisis has greatly accelerated a pre-existing trend towards digitalization. We're not going to go back to the status quo ante. We will see much more people operating, living, working through digital. There's no question of that. And digital has shown its many virtues, but it's also highlights some of the constraints. First, you know, in the most well-off households, there's over 90% connectivity. In low-income households, it's well under 20%. In many countries, it's under 10%. So this this necessity of working by remote, educating our kids by remote, so observing social distancing, having our social lives by remote, that is something that a very large part of the world simply cannot do. So I think one thing I hope this crisis will help us do better is overcome the digital divide. And I hope there'll be greater urgency in doing that. And of course, digital has brought a lot of wonderful goods. I mean, it's allowed researchers in an unprecedented way to crowdsource solutions. It's allowed that data to be exchanged between governments in ways that helps them much better track the spread of the virus. It's allowed public health information to be put out at a record speed. But it's also allowed for disinformation. It's also allowed for a growth in social harms. Child abuse has gone up, according to UNICEF, in the current crisis. So I think it's also highlighted the need for the world to come together better and do what DiploFoundation has been promoting for many years, increase digital cooperation to better contain the harms and to better promote the good. So I hope the urgency of digital cooperation will be underlined by this crisis. And in terms of, do we need a crisis to learn? I'm afraid that's a tragic lesson from history. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the United Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations, came into being, the League of Nations, after the terrible suffering of the First World War, and incidentally also of the pandemic of that time, the Spanish influenza. But it took that suffering and that senseless murder, displacement, and destruction of all good things to make the world come up with a structure that was meant to deliver better. And it didn't do its job adequately. And that led to the Second World War, contributed to the Second World War. And the UN was born out of the aspirations to do better that time after the suffering of the Second World War. So I hope very much, I mean, this crisis would be a tragically missed opportunity. And we will be remembered very poorly by the generations who come after us if we don't let the better angels of our nature prevail, as Ambassador Batir called for us to do, and make sure that we come to our senses and that we make the most out of this crisis to reflect very seriously as member states, as UN institutions, what we could and should have done better and how we will do better to ensure that next time crisis struck, we will deliver better, and the next time, and we will deal better with the slow onset COVIDs, like climate change that are still with us, like growing inequality, like the persistence of conflict, and we will take our responsibilities with greater earnestness, thanks to the infusion of realism by this terrible crisis.
Thank you. And I think this is an excellent question we should all keep in mind. Is this the crisis that will help us to engage in the needed reform of the multilateral system to make it a better version of itself? Also the question, who are the people who should become active now? And obviously the UN is a big player in that. But also just a brief reminder, we are organizing this debate in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. And that's basically an organization that brings together diplomatic training institutions and universities teaching diplomacy, broadly speaking. And I think they now also have a huge responsibility to take on board what we're seeing right now and bring that into the next generation. But before I use the opportunity of having Dr. Owen Williams with us to go deeper into the WHO and questions of global health governance, Owen, I would like to hear just your quick reflections on what we've been hearing so far from our online audience, who, by the way, is now more than 150 people.
Thank you, Kat, for inviting me today, or tonight, as it is in Australia. I'm just going to pick up on 3 points because I think the other two speakers have dealt with other areas particularly well. The first is the question of whether this crisis is a crisis mainly affecting Western developed countries. Now, unfortunately, well, it's not nice in any case, whoever this pandemic affects, but I'm afraid the effects are about to be borne out in the developing world. In a number of countries, the epi curves are charting particularly badly. And these are in countries, for example, such as India and a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where public health systems and health systems in general are particularly weak. We will see in coming weeks and coming months a huge tragedy unfold unless the multilateral system is agile and able to respond to that unfolding crisis. And every signal we have to date does not suggest that that will be the case. And political will in many countries is still largely lacking in terms of a sensibility that would suggest a good response at the national level to crises. For example, you can pick out Brazil at the moment is suffering a real crisis of leadership at the national level in how it responds to COVID. So this won't be confined to the developed world, and unfortunately, it will become a particular crisis of the developing world very soon. The second is in terms of multilateral coordination in the face of this crisis in the last 2 months. Now, I think the World Health Organization has been absolutely amazing and consistent in its messaging on COVID, and has been a credit to that organization, a largely politically and financially emasculated organization in recent decades, has really risen to this challenge, and its messaging has been crystal clear, at least since the end of February, and it should be congratulated for that response. However, both in health and more widely in the multilateral system, we have seen in recent decades a plethora of new institutions grow up around health and around aid and around development. And I'm afraid my judgment, and I might be shot down on this, is that what we have is an incoherent and unled response by and large. Finally, I'll take the point about, do we need a crisis to learn? Now, this is a crisis of unprecedented scale in global health, but it comes on the back of a series of pandemic crises in recent decades. We've had SARS, we've had MERS, we've had H5N1, we've had a series of pandemic threats, largely confined to the developing world, to Southeast Asia, to West Africa, to Central Africa, to the Middle East. And we have not learned or acted upon the lessons of those crises to a sufficient scale that would have enabled us to have responded properly to this crisis. So I would like to believe that this will be the signal lesson. This will be the point of change. However, it has to be backed up with sufficient resources and adjustments in how we conduct a series of critical interventions in health across the world and in all sectors related to health. And resources must be plowed in to making us capable not only of learning lessons, but acting on those lessons. And that is the real challenge, is putting the resources into where we know they need to go. We have known where they have needed to go. Those resources have needed to go for at least 20 years, but they have not been forthcoming. And that is a sad lesson of this crisis more than any other.
Thank you, Owen. And actually, this brings me to a question we want to put to our audience. So I would like our speakers not to vote in this poll, but we have a poll for our audience, and we are asking the question: after the immediate crises, multilateral diplomacy, and in particular the UN system, will continue as before, undergo reform, or be radically transformed? And this is something that our speakers touched upon, and I would be very interested to see what the people who are joining us online think on this question. Okay, it's very interesting. So undergo reform is, with almost 2/3, the majority answer. But radically transformed is also gaining about 20%. So maybe to stop the poll. So basically what we've seen is, from our online audience, your idea of how multilateral diplomacy and the UN system will change is that it will undergo reform, but at least 20%, which is a substantial amount, thinks that we will see a radical transformation. So this is going to be exceedingly interesting. But speaking about the multilateral system, Owen, I wanted to go a bit deeper into two things you already mentioned, which is first, the role of the WHO. You already mentioned you think the WHO has to be commended for its crisis response, at least since mid-February. And then you already alluded to something else, which is other actors in this field, non-state actors. So we talked a lot about states and international organizations, but one question we need to ask, what about other actors within this field? And basically, Owen, for you, in light of COVID-19, what are the things we should be keeping an eye on with regard to these non-state actors? Owen, you need to unmute yourself.
Kat, I don't want to contradict your framing of the question, but part of the problem here in global health governance is how crowded a space it has become, at least since the Millennium Development Goal era. I mean, we've become specialists in institutional creationism in health at the multilateral level. Way back, we've had IRVs, GAVIs, global funds, DNDIs, unit aids. You know, this is acronym central. There's overlapping remits. There's conflicts in terms of who gets what in terms of funding, in funding rounds, funding calls, in who has a duty of care with regard to vaccine development, with regard to supply chain management when it comes to critical health technologies. This is a very, very crowded multilateral space. You can add to that then the non-state actors. You know, much of the provision of care for the HIV crisis, pandemic crisis, which pre-exists the present one, in many developing countries is conducted by faith-based organizations, by philanthropic organizations, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there's been a rise and rise of kind of private actors in the global health space. It's a very, very, very complex space. Even in this crisis, there are calls for new agencies to be created to take care of pandemic events at the multilateral level. Now, there's an elephant in the room here, and it's a good elephant, and that's the World Health Organization. Now, this is an organization which, within this recent history of institutional creationism, has fared very, very, very badly in terms of funding. If we are to look to the future, we should look to the past, because the institutional and technical capacities lie within the World Health Organization to do the job properly. Added to that, the other elephant in the room in this crisis and learning from it is the role of the private sector in medical R&D and in the development of new technologies to meet both new and old medical problems. It is clear from the present crisis that the market mechanism for the development of drugs is simply not up to the job of developing at least vaccines to respond to pandemic events, notwithstanding its ability to produce and give access to the people in need of drugs for pre-existing conditions such as cancers, diabetes, and so on and so forth. Now, if we are to learn from this event, is that we do not have a medical development and access system that is fit for human use. It fails people routinely, and this cannot be allowed to perpetuate, because it costs people on a quotidian basis who suffer from cancer, or people who can't access opioids for palliative care, but also in our failure to prepare for pandemic events with proper vaccine development initiatives, despite the rise of organizations such as CEPI and so on and so forth. We have, again, an incoherent multilateral space which butts up very badly with the private sector and the market structure for the development and dispersal of drugs and health technologies, but also healthcare and health systems.
Let me maybe stop you there, because the conversation in the chat has been advancing quite a bit. So we've seen a couple of comments on the poll. We've seen questions around nationalism and then focusing more on developing countries. And again, let me ask my colleague Natasha to provide us with the more in-depth summary of what's been happening there.
Thank you, Kat. As you've already mentioned, we have received some comments on how national measures that are being implemented in response to the crisis and the consequences that these measures will have on multilateralism. For instance, Flair highlighted that states are already banning exports of medicine with the examples of the European Union and India recently, and that there is a threat that, well, that nationalism is growing and that people are mostly thinking of themselves, and that this is that international organizations are really needed during this time, raising the question, will multilateralism triumph? Mohamed Toukabri also highlighted that the virus has come at a very delicate moment, and that during recent years, many nationalist decision makers and voices have emerged in key countries which have all affected multilateral functioning. We also had comments on the tangible aspects that are needed for people to support change from Richard Hill. And there were comments also on how the UN or the WTO, for instance, would come up with legal instruments to control prices of key commodities in order to prevent the distortion of markets, for instance, which was proposed as a tangible aspect. There were comments on the developing countries. Sarah, who noted that the WHO and the international partners have done a great work for specifically engaging the African Union in training health practitioners on testing, and they have also encouraged governments to prepare for the pandemic way before there were cases on the continent. Our attendees also reflected on the transition to digital, where Flo noted that digital has shown how easy it is to shut out civil societies from online meetings, while Mark has agreed that digital can be at this point raised to a new level. However, the question is if we can take advantage of this opportunity or not. Denise noted that credit is due to the clarity of message from the WHO at this time, who has made efforts in competing with misinformation. And there were also comments on the reform of the UN with Amudine, who noted that the UN will be radically reformed because we do not know the impacts of this pandemic, and there is no precedence in the modern age. Richard Smith said that the extent of the reform of the UN system will depend on how the global power balance changes as a result of the crisis. That would be all from the text chat.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Just to give everyone the final results from the poll, so speaking about the multilateral system and the United Nations in particular, 23%, and almost everyone voted. So 23% argue it will continue as before. 59% think we will see reforms, as we've just heard from Natasha also in the discussion. And then last but not least, 19% think it will be radically transformed. So with that, and kind of with one eye on the clock, I have one final question for our participants. And maybe they can combine their answer with some comments or reflections on what we just heard from our online audience. So the final question I'd like to pose to our three speakers is, from your perspective, what lessons need to be learned? How will or how should the multilateral diplomacy and the UN adapt, specifically and very focused? So over to you for, so to speak, final reflections. And if I may, I suggest we go in the same order as before. So that means Ambassador Batia, Under Secretary General Hochschild, and then Owen Williams. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Well, first, I want to pose a counterfactual. If we don't do anything, if we simply sit back and don't coordinate our response, this pandemic will burn through the world. It'll take several years for it to go through. It'll go through various regions. And that's a horror scenario that obviously nobody wants. And this is a virus that doesn't sleep, it doesn't eat. This virus is basically going to be active. It's laid bare mercilessly the vulnerabilities of our international health system, as Dr. Williams said, some of the redundancies about global health governance. So clearly doing nothing, not bolstering international cooperation is simply not something that we can do. I just want to focus on one thing. It's very crucial to bear in mind that the multilateral trading system must continue. Trade connectivity, supply chain connectivity, it's so crucial. We can't turn inward. It's absolutely crucial that we continue, all of us at a national level, the international level, we must uphold trade connectivity. PPEs, essential goods must continue to flow amid these challenging circumstances. This is a critical pillar. If we don't keep that going, then it's essentially going to be a set of national responses. But this is a virus, again, that doesn't sleep, it doesn't eat. This virus doesn't need a visa, it goes around. It's a problem without a passport. And if we cannot bolster international cooperation, we won't be able to respond efficiently and effectively to the COVID-19 virus. So very crucial point. Maintain our connectivity, supply chain, and trade and work together. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'll highlight 4 key points that I take away from this discussion, and where I think we need to do better. I think after this crisis, and I think some of it's starting now, we need a very honest accounting of what went well and what did not went well. What were our strengths that need to be further bolstered? What were our weaknesses that need to be rapidly corrected? So a very quick, true, and objective accounting for how we could have saved more lives, both through earlier action and what sort of actions were very effective and should be boosted. I think secondly, we need, and this goes to something the other speaker spoke to, we need to make international cooperation much more inclusive. This sort of siloed approaches where we have governments on the one hand, tech companies, drug suppliers siloed in another part, and then civil society somewhere else, and sort of talking to each other occasionally doesn't work. The handles of power in a different place than they were 75 years ago, and our institutions need to adapt to that, both in terms of inclusivity of governments in a different constellation than the one we have today, but also inclusivity of other actors. I think there'll be greater pressure for that. And thirdly, I think we need a major mindset change. I mean, I live in a country where we frequently hear that globalization, international cooperation is some form of ideology and to be set up in opposition to patriotism. That's a false dichotomy, and if nothing has taught us this crisis did. You can't be a patriot today unless you also care about the global commons. The global commons has to be everybody's concern, and your country lives at its peril to the extent it doesn't understand that and exercise solidarity. And we all need to promote that mindset change. And fourthly and lastly, I'd go back to my point on digital cooperation. Digital is not the future, it's become part of the present, but that is exacerbating existing inequalities unless we make sure that it's more inclusive. And also, we need to steer it better for good than we've done so far globally. So those would be my 4 points.
I've got 3. And a quick plug, commercial, so unapologetically. The first is that we clearly need to invest in global public goods, and health being a critical global public good. We have not done so. And in fact, we've instituted regimes such as the WTO TRIPS agreement, which mean that we systematically denigrate global public goods such as access to medicines. And we're paying for that at present. The second is about value, it's about what we value. And if we value, as Ambassador Bataille said, if we value trade and globalization and these are critical to our lives and livelihoods now. We need a counterpart system of value where we think about what our vital systems are that make those things function. And health and the climate and pollution are all part of those vital systems. And they need to be elevated to a level above the systems that we've put in place to support the architectures of trade, investment, and credit globally. The third is about time. We've become an endemically short-term political and economic global culture. We are almost incapable of thinking in the medium and long term. This needs to change dramatically. As a species, for our survival, we must shift to a new conception of time in both politics and economics. And we are not doing that, and we should. The fourth and final is my commercial break. I've just launched a digital platform this week, which is the COVID-19 Diaries, and which encourages normal, everyday people working in global health and in diplomacy to record their experience on a day-to-day or weekly basis of the unfolding crises, both as a therapeutic and a communicative tool. I would strongly encourage any of you that are interested in that COVID Diaries to log in, register, and start blogging on this crisis. Your input would be enormously valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. All that remains for me to do is thank our speakers and all the people who joined us online. We now have the total count, people joining us here in Zoom and people on Facebook combined. We had 300 people with us, which is an amazing number, and amazing that you've all been with us for this conversation. A couple of points in terms of follow-up. We will have our next debate in the context of the COVID crisis on Thursday on cybersecurity and the shift to online. And one of my colleagues maybe can put the link in the chat so you can get that information. But also speaking in terms of follow-up, I picked up there are several things. So there is the diary project from Dr. Owen Williams, and in the follow-up we will include the link to that so you can see what it's all about. But there are also two other important conversations to be had, which is one, the consultations on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And perhaps this is also a debate we can bring into Diplo, but also into the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. But then also at Diplo, we would like to engage in a kind of foresight exercise called the day after, so the day after the crisis. And here again, I call on all on you, your networks, as well as the International Forum on Diplomatic Training to help us in that kind of exercise. What will happen after the crisis? How will the world look like? But now, without further ado, thank you for joining us online, and thank you so much for our three fantastic speakers, Undersecretary Hochschild, Ambassador Batia, and Dr. Williams. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm amazed and I'm very happy. And to everyone, a good day, and see you soon online.
Thank you, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And it was an honor to be with you. Bye now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.